Today, I'll bring this forward just a little bit. There we go. Today, we are revisiting the Empire of Persia. Last week, we looked at it through Esther's eyes, and this morning, I would like to look at it through Mordecai's eyes. Mordecai, who many would argue is just as influential as Esther. Some think that he should have had the title of the book. But that all aside, he's an interesting character to look at. So often we just look at Esther, but Mordecai has much to share. Mordecai, an older man, I suspect, he chose to raise his young cousin when her parents died. Not an easy thing to do. And unlike his enemy in the story, Haman, it would appear that perhaps he doesn't have any other family. Haman, it's very clear in the book, has 10 sons and an interesting wife, whereas Mordecai, all we hear about is Esther. And so reading between the lines, I have a feeling Esther was it for Mordecai. Mordecai also, though a Jew, a foreigner in Persia, worked at the palace gates every day. And so he knew more than most what it was like to live in Persia and what was going on. All the intrigue, working at those gates, he had a fair idea. And so he was most likely there in Esther chapter 1 when Xerxes threw that amazing banquet, inviting his entire city for a week of just full-on celebrations, no holds barred, seemingly quite magnanimous. And he was also there to witness Vashti's fall from grace. Vashti, the current queen, who refused to appear before her king and his guests, fell from grace and was banished. Our very first story in the book. And so in order to, I think, do it justice, we need to look at that. I'd invite you to turn to Esther chapter 1 as we just start with Vashti's experience. So she herself was holding a banquet for all the women, and she gets this message, "Come, I want everyone to see how beautiful you are wearing your crown." And she's like, "No, I'm not coming." And this is what in Esther chapter 1, starting from verse 16, this is what the advisors say to Xerxes. There's Mordecai. I always forget to show you the pictures. Oh, there we go. Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, "King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come." This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from least to the greatest. You know, it's interesting that this story is included right at the start of the book and in such detail, even down to the dialogue between the king and his advisors. And I believe it's there because it sets a tone and it gives the reader clear insight into just what this world was like. Though affluent, cosmopolitan, powerful, probably often fun, Persia had a darker side. It was a world where respect was demanded. A world where respect was demanded. starting in the home, but extending to all levels of society. And it was willing to punish, even to the point of destruction, those who didn't bend the knee. And this is not something to be brushed over. This is clearly identifying the power in which this system was based on. And it's not God's. Because respect by force is the very opposite of God's character. It belongs to that of Satan. It has always been his trademark. If you think of the different stories through the Bible, we saw it with King Nebuchadnezzar. Prior to him coming to know God, he forced an edict for people to respect him. If you don't bow to my statue, you will die. When he was in the desert, Jesus faced Satan. And again, Satan said to him, this is in Luke, see all this, all these kingdoms? They're mine. If you bow your knee to me, I'll give them to you. But of course, Jesus didn't. He refused to bow to Satan. And consequently, the worldly powers of the Jewish aristocracy, combining with Roman rule, turned against him and crucified him. And it has been seen throughout history. Tyrannical empires with rulers demanding respect on pain of death. Hitler, Stalin, there is so many of them. Again, these empires based on the opposite of God's character. And even when you look in Revelation 13, John symbolically describes Satan's power, the end of time, and we're not doing a big Rev study. But again, the theme is right down to the end. We have the dragon. The dragon was in... that's Hadassah. The dragon... I'm going to get someone to do this for me because I can't do two things at once. The dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. We know these pretty famous verses. Then in 13, it was given power, the beast, to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that it could speak and cause all who refuse to worship the image to be killed. This theme of forced respect, going against the very nature of God's character, is from the beginning to the end. It is a trademark of Satan's way of doing things. This was the world that Mordecai lived in. This is the world that we live in. A world where the dragon still works through empires and individuals at will. His trademarks are power, pride, and force. And in this sort of world, injustice can appear to have the upper hand. It did for Mordecai, because Vashti was banished and Hadassah was taken. Hadassah, his chosen daughter. Hadassah, who he had taken in, not easy, not convenient, but the right thing to do, the honourable thing to do, the faithful thing to do. And as he made those sacrifices that come with choosing to be a parent suddenly, I would say he also found the blessings that come too. Suddenly he wasn't alone, he had a daughter, he had dreams of grandchildren, life, joy. He was innocence and joy when all around him was intrigue and power, corruption. And then she was gone. And along with her, all that joy, all those dreams, grandchildren was ripped away. And in their place, loneliness moved in. What do you do when the unthinkable happens? When evil appears to have the upper hand? Mordecai stayed faithful. He used his wits. He tried to protect Esther, Hadassah, as much as best he could. He said, don't tell them who you are. Lay low. Hopefully you'll survive. And he stayed in touch. And this is what I guess I'm basing my relationship between him and her on, is that when she was taken, it says in Esther chapter 2:11 that every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Every day. And one day, as he was doing so, he uncovered a plot against the king. 2:21. During the time of Mordecai, I was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes, the same king who took away Hadassah. What do? Mordecai again holds course. He does the honourable thing. In verse 22, Mordecai found out about the plot, told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. Now, it was a well-known custom of Persian kings that they reward amazingly their benefactors. They may banish you at whim, but on the flip side, they throw amazing banquets, and they were well known for their generosity in rewarding those who sided with them. And so as the story should have gone, Mordecai should have been the benefactor. It's clear that he was the one given credit, not Esther. He should have been rewarded amazingly for this, which means the very next verse is incredibly significant. Chapter 3. Straight away it says, after these events, King Xerxes honoured Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honour higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honour to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour. I bet he didn't. It would seem that no matter how faithful Mordecai was, no matter how much he tried to do the right thing, he just doesn't get a win. He takes Hadassah in, she's taken away from him. He sticks his neck out for the king, and it would have been very much sticking his neck out to put a word in. In that palace, you take any side, you make enemies, and it seems that they're all pretty ruthless. So by speaking up, he was putting himself in danger. He does this, his enemy is promoted instead of him. It's not easy getting kicked in the stomach. You stand up for what's right and you cop a punishment. You stay faithful to someone and they leave you in the dust. You help someone and they're there until they don't need you anymore. Perhaps you give someone your trust and it's not honoured. Getting kicked in the stomach when you do the right thing and it's not returned to you. You can be tempted to ask why. What's the point? Jeremiah, he even writes, he said, You are always righteous, O Lord, when I bring a case before you. Yet I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease? It can sometimes, those questions can arise. I've done what's right. What's the issue? Well, there's a simple answer that's partly true. That's what happens when you live in Persia. In this world you will have trouble. But there is more than just a simple reminder in this story that we live in a fallen world. The story goes on. In verse 3 of chapter 3. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behaviour would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. And so Haman, rather than reading the next 3 chapters, he manipulates the king into letting him pass an edict that would enable him to destroy the entire race. The king seems to just go ahead with this, no worries. Haman casts what was called a pur, or a lot, and ironically it falls on the eve of the Passover, the celebration where the Jews celebrated the way God had rescued them in the past, is the date when they were going to be annihilated. Mordecai goes to Esther, as we looked at last week. She goes to the king, risks her life. The king accepts her, and she starts this plan. She says, I'd like to invite you and Haman to a banquet. The king feels pretty good. He's, yes, that would be lovely, my dear. Haman thinks it's amazing. He's like, I'm going to this private banquet with just the king. How important am I? And so off they go. The first banquet starts, awesome. Haman goes, and then on his way home he sees Mordecai. And the fact that Mordecai is not bowing to him just sticks like that in his gut. And he goes home and he says, how can I be happy with Mordecai out there? And his wife delicately says to him, well, dear, why don't you just have him impaled? And Haman's like, that's a brilliant idea. I'll set the pole up tonight, which he does. And then that night, the story shifts. Up until now, everything is heading to putty. It seems like evil has the upper hand, apart from Esther's doing pretty well by now. But for Mordecai, it's not looking good. But that night, it shifts. Xerxes can't sleep. This story shifts on Xerxes being unable to sleep. He can't sleep, and so he asks for the book of the Annals, the Chronicles, to be read to him. That normally does the trick. Doesn't this night. It seems that book is read to him the entire night because it's morning when the case of Mordecai is read. And he's like, what do we do for that man? Nothing. He's like, that can't be right. Something must be done. Right then, Haman comes in, ready to ask to get Mordecai impaled. Get that out of the way, then he can go to the banquet in the evening. Comes in, the king's like, what should be done for the man the king wants to honour? Haman's like, this is my day. And so he sets up this amazing honouring procession in which the king, of course, turns around and says, well, I want you to do that for Mordecai. And off he goes. That brings us up to speed. He returns home, and it's his wife, again, who speaks to him. And I want to read it to you, because I think I just like it. Chapter 6, verse 13. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet. And there, the rest of the story takes its course. At that feast, Haman's unmasked, he's condemned, he is impaled on that pole he set up for Mordecai, and the edict is sent forth to save the Jews. You know, often, we are unable to see the bigger picture that would give us so much understanding and so much hope, so much purpose in our current situations. Had Mordecai been rewarded for saving the king's life in the usual timely manner that link, that important link in the chain, would not have been there to save him and his people down the track. Had Esther not been taken away, she would never have been made queen to enable her to save, again, Mordecai, herself, and the rest of her people. The most significant injustices in Mordecai's life proved to bring about the most significant blessings, not only for him, but also his people. And that is the beauty of God's power in an evil world. God can and does bring incredible good out of horrible situations. And it doesn't mean that suddenly those injustices are not unjust. It doesn't mean that the pain is suddenly not pain. It doesn't mean that the wrong suddenly is not wrong. But God can redeem. And the most significant example is Christ on the cross, where all the forces of evil gathered. And in that mighty, unjust act, God's power brought the most amazing redemption for all of us. God was sovereign, and God is sovereign still. But try telling that to Mordecai at the time, when all of that's happening. He can't see that. When he's standing in the dust of Haman's carriage as it rolls by, when he sees Haman being just rising in power, being given the impetus to carry out his evil schemes, when he sees his daughter being taken away and knows what is ahead. In all of this, God would seem quite absent. And he's faced with a choice: to believe in God's presence through faith, or to abandon it to despair. And we too are faced with that same choice. When we are in those situations where you just cannot see God's hand, we are faced with a choice of either holding on in faith or giving in to despair. Interestingly, this is the last point. Interestingly, there is actually no mention of God in the book of Esther at all, from start to finish. His name is not mentioned. No prayer is written. The closest it gets is to Esther calling for a fast. But nowhere else is God's name actually mentioned. Yet because it's in the book of the Bible, in the Bible as a whole, because it's in the context of God's word, we see his hand through the whole story. You see his hand working. And sometimes our lives are the same. When we look at them devoid of God, when we step away from him, it can seem like he is not present. But when you place your life in the context of faith, of a God that is present, when you take time to read his word and pray, suddenly, sometimes it's not suddenly, sometimes it takes a bit of time, but you start to see his hand too, weaving blessings into your life. Coincidences are not always coincidences, are not often coincidences, I don't believe. But when we take time to place our lives in the context of God, we see him more, just like the book of Esther. To me, that was a huge reminder. And that's my prayer for us this morning, that as we face the injustices of this world that we live in, and they come, you can't always see God's hand so clearly, that we choose to hold on to faith. Like Mordecai, that we stay a straight course. We choose to do the right thing when it hurts. And in doing so, we can trust that God will bring blessings. He will redeem those situations. He will be with us through it all. May we faithfully hold on to him, look to him, and see him weave blessings in each of our lives, our own personal stories. That's my prayer.